Captain Marcus Chen hadn't worn his uniform in 3 years, but the weight of it still pressed against his shoulders like a phantom limb. The Polish countryside blurred past the window of the military transport, flat and gray under March clouds that threatened snow. He'd left the Marines with an honorable discharge, a chest full of medals he kept in a shoebox, and a gnawing sense that he'd left something unfinished in the dust of Afghanistan. Now he was back, not as a warrior, but as a civilian contractor, a liaison between NATO forces and local intelligence networks operating in the shadow of the Ukrainian conflict. The base at Powitz was a strange hybrid of old Soviet architecture and modern American efficiency. Concrete bunkers sat alongside prefabricated command centers, and the air smelled of diesel fuel and pine forests. Marcus had been brought in to consult on security protocols for Operation Iron Bridge, a massive troop movement that would see 800 American soldiers convoy through Poland to reinforce positions near the Belarusian border. It was supposed to be routine, a show of force and solidarity that happened every few months. Marcus was supposed to review the route, sign off on the security assessment, and collect his paycheck. He should have known better. Nothing was ever routine. The briefing room was overheated and cramped, filled with officers who looked at him with barely concealed irritation. Contractors weren't real military, not in their eyes. Colonel Davidson, a career officer with silver hair and a politician's smile, stood at the front with a laser pointer, clicking through slides of topographical maps and intelligence summaries. The convoy route was a red line cutting through rural Poland, avoiding major cities, sticking to secondary roads that would minimize civilian interaction. It looked clean. Too clean. Marcus raised his hand during the question period, his voice rough from disuse in formal settings. "Sir, what's the latest HUMINT from the eastern sectors? The route passes within 30 kilometers of known smuggling corridors." Davidson's smile thinned. "Our intelligence indicates minimal threat activity. Local police have those corridors monitored. This isn't Helmand Province, Captain Chen. We're in NATO territory." The dismissal was clear, but Marcus felt the familiar tightening in his gut, the same instinct that had kept him alive through 4 deployments. He'd learned to trust that feeling more than any satellite image or intelligence brief. After the meeting dispersed, he approached Major Sarah Kowalski, the intelligence officer who'd been conspicuously quiet during the briefing. She was younger than him, maybe 30, with sharp eyes and the kind of focus that suggested she actually read the reports instead of just filing them. "Off the record," Marcus said quietly. "What aren't they telling us?" Kowalski glanced around the emptying room, then leaned closer. "There have been communication blackouts in Sector 7, right along your route, 3 times in the last 2 weeks. Could be equipment failure, could be atmospheric interference, or it could be someone testing our response times. And Davidson wants this convoy to go off without a hitch. He's up for a star, and any delay or route change makes him look paranoid. You didn't hear that from me." Marcus spent the next 2 days doing what he did best, looking at the details everyone else ignored. He requisitioned access to the satellite feed archives, cross-referenced patrol reports with local police logs, and mapped the communication blackouts Kowalski had mentioned. The pattern emerged slowly, like a photograph developing in a darkroom. The blackouts weren't random. They occurred during specific times, always when surveillance would be at its weakest, always in areas where the terrain offered natural cover for large groups. He found something else too, financial records that didn't add up. Supply requisitions from a logistics officer named Captain Brennan showed purchases of equipment that never made it into inventory, fuel allotments that exceeded what any legitimate operation would need, money flowing through accounts that disappeared into the bureaucratic maze of military contracting. Marcus had seen this before in Iraq when officers had been skimming reconstruction funds, but this felt different. This felt organized. On the 3rd night, working alone in his temporary office while snow fell silent against the windows, Marcus pulled up the convoy route again and overlaid it with everything he'd found. The blackout zones, the suspicious financial activity, the terrain analysis. And there it was, written in the data like a death sentence, a 5-kilometer stretch of rural road that passed through a dense forest, with hills on both sides, minimal civilian presence, and a history of smuggling activity. If he wanted to ambush a convoy, that's exactly where he'd do it. His hands shook as he printed the analysis, his mind already running through the scenarios. 800 soldiers in soft-skinned vehicles, strung out along a narrow road, caught in a killing zone with high ground on both flanks. RPGs and heavy machine guns could shred the column in minutes. It would be the deadliest attack on American forces in Europe since World War II, and every instinct he possessed told him it was about to happen. Marcus tried the official route first. He requested a meeting with Colonel Davidson, presenting his findings in a formal report complete with maps and supporting evidence. Davidson listened with the patience of a man indulging a child's fears, then set the report aside with a gentle smile that made Marcus want to put a fist through the wall. "Captain Chen, I appreciate your thoroughness, but you're seeing patterns where there's only noise. The route has been cleared by NATO intelligence, Polish military intelligence, and our own security assessment team. We can't change our operational plans based on coincidental data points and hunches. That's not how modern warfare works. With respect, sir, modern warfare is exactly when these kinds of coordinated attacks happen. Hybrid warfare, irregular forces, insider threats. Enough." Davidson's smile vanished. "You were brought here to consult, not to run the operation. The convoy departs in 48 hours on the planned route. If you can't support that decision, you're free to return to civilian life. Permanently." Marcus left the office, feeling the walls closing in. The same trapped sensation he'd felt in Kandahar when bad intelligence had sent his unit into an ambush. He'd survived that day because a young lance corporal had ignored orders and repositioned their vehicles at the last second. 3 men had died anyway. He still saw their faces when he couldn't sleep. He spent the next 24 hours trying to go through proper channels. He called the Defense Intelligence Agency, but without Davidson's support, they wouldn't listen to a contractor. He tried reaching out to Polish military contacts, but the language barrier and jurisdictional red tape made it impossible to get traction. Every door closed. Every official channel led to the same dead end. The system was designed to follow orders, not to question them, and Marcus was just noise in the machine. With 18 hours until the convoy's departure, Marcus made the decision that would destroy his life. He couldn't watch 800 soldiers drive into a massacre. He couldn't live with that weight, so he stopped asking for permission and started acting like the Marine captain he used to be. He used his old security clearances, the ones that technically should have been revoked but lingered in the system like ghosts. He accessed the convoy's command network and sent encrypted messages to 3 senior NCOs he'd served with, men who knew him and trusted his judgment. The message was simple: abort the original route, take the alternate northern path, and do it quietly. He gave them his analysis, his evidence, everything he had. Then he sent a message to Major Kowalski, CCing it to every intelligence officer on the base. If he was going down, at least the truth would be on record. The convoy diverted 6 hours before dawn, rolling out on the northern route while the original path lay empty and waiting. Marcus watched from the operations center, surrounded by shocked officers who were only now realizing what had happened. Davidson's face had gone purple with rage, but there was nothing he could do. The convoy was already moving, and reversing course would create exactly the kind of chaos and vulnerability that made them a target. Marcus expected to be arrested immediately. Instead, Davidson ordered him confined to quarters while military police were summoned. It was a strange limbo sitting in his small room while the sun rose and the convoy made its way safely through Polish farmland. He didn't sleep. He waited for news, for confirmation that he'd been wrong, that he'd destroyed his reputation over paranoia and bad data. The call came at 1400 hours. A reconnaissance drone, dispatched to survey the original route as part of the post-operation analysis, had found the ambush site. 53 enemy combatants, a mixture of former Wagner Group mercenaries and local criminal elements, 12 RPG-7 launchers, 6 heavy machine guns, and 42 improvised explosive devices buried along a 5-kilometer stretch of road. Enough firepower to annihilate the convoy 3 times over. The enemy force had waited through the night and into the morning before realizing their target wasn't coming. By the time NATO quick reaction forces arrived, the site was abandoned except for equipment and intelligence materials left in hasty retreat. Marcus thought that would be the end of it. He'd been right. 800 soldiers were alive because he'd trusted his instincts and violated every protocol in the book. He expected consequences, maybe a formal reprimand, maybe the termination of his contract. What he didn't expect was silence. For 3 days, nothing happened. The convoy completed its mission. The ambush site was processed by intelligence teams. Official reports were filed and classified, and Marcus remained in his quarters, his security credentials revoked, his requests for information ignored. It was Major Kowalski who finally came to him, slipping into his room after dark with the haunted look of someone who'd seen something they wished they could unsee. "They're going to court-martial you," she said without preamble. "Davidson and 3 other senior officers. They're filing charges of insubordination, unauthorized access to classified systems, and reckless endangerment of military operations." Marcus stared at her, the words not quite making sense. "They're charging me with saving 800 lives? They're charging you with violating the chain of command and making them look incompetent. The ambush evidence has been classified at the highest levels. The official story is that the convoy took an alternate route due to weather concerns, and you interfered with operational planning based on paranoid delusions. They've already started building the case. Witnesses who will say you showed signs of PTSD, that you'd been acting erratically, that your analysis was fundamentally flawed. That's insane. The evidence disappeared, or got reclassified, or somehow became inconclusive. Marcus, this goes deeper than Davidson's ego. Someone wanted that convoy to get hit. The financial trails you found, the equipment that went missing. I kept digging after you were confined. Captain Brennan and 2 other logistics officers have been funneling weapons and equipment to the same networks that organized the ambush. They were getting paid, probably millions, and your convoy was supposed to be the proof that NATO can't protect its forces, a propaganda victory and a payday all in one. When you stopped it, you didn't just save lives. You cost some very dangerous people a lot of money and exposed a conspiracy that reaches into our command structure. The rage that filled Marcus was cold and clean, the kind of anger that came from absolute clarity. So they're going to sacrifice me to cover their asses, unless you fight back. And even if you do, they have the system on their side. I'm risking my career just being here." She handed him a flash drive. "Copies of everything I could recover. It's not much, but it's something. I believe you, Marcus. A lot of the junior officers and NCOs do, but belief doesn't stop a court-martial." The proceedings began 2 weeks later in a military courtroom that felt more like a theater than a place of justice. Marcus sat at the defense table next to his appointed attorney, Captain Jennifer Reeves, a JAG officer who'd taken one look at his case and declared it the most politically motivated prosecution she'd seen in 15 years. She was brilliant and relentless, but they both knew they were fighting against a machine designed to protect itself, not to find truth. The prosecution's case was elegant in its simplicity. They painted Marcus as a troubled veteran, a man who couldn't let go of his combat experience, who saw enemies everywhere and couldn't adapt to the realities of peacetime operations. They brought in psychiatrists who'd never met him to discuss PTSD and paranoid ideation. They presented his after-action reports from Afghanistan, highlighting every moment of aggression, every instance where he'd questioned orders, building a narrative of a man who'd never really left the war. Colonel Davidson took the stand with the gravitas of a man defending civilization itself. Captain Chen's actions, however well-intentioned, represented a fundamental breakdown of military discipline. In modern operations, we rely on systematic intelligence analysis, not individual hunches. By circumventing the chain of command, he created chaos and confusion that could have resulted in catastrophic consequences. That his interference happened to coincide with the discovery of a separate threat does not justify his violation of protocol. The separate threat, that's what they called it now. Not an ambush targeting the convoy he saved, just a random element that happened to be positioned along their original route. The classified evidence that proved otherwise was deemed inadmissible on national security grounds. Captain Reeves fought back with everything she had. She called the NCOs who'd diverted the convoy, men who testified that Marcus's warning had been credible and backed by solid analysis. She presented what remained of his intelligence reports, the patterns he'd identified, the financial irregularities that still existed in the records even if their implications had been scrubbed. She argued that Marcus had acted in accordance with his duty to protect American lives, that blind obedience to orders was not the same as military discipline. But with each passing day, Marcus could feel the verdict crystallizing. The panel of officers listened with professional courtesy, but their eyes held the cold calculation of men protecting their institution. The media had been kept away, the proceedings sealed under national security classifications. Whatever happened in this courtroom would disappear into the classified archives, another inconvenient truth buried in the name of operational security. The breaking point came during the prosecution's closing arguments. when they played a recording of Marcus's encrypted message to the convoy NCOs. His voice filled the courtroom, urgent and convinced, laying out the evidence of the ambush. The prosecutor paused the recording and turned to the panel. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not the voice of a professional analyst. This is the voice of a man in the grip of delusion, so convinced of his own righteousness that he was willing to risk an international incident, willing to undermine months of planning, willing to substitute his judgment for that of his superior officers. Captain Chen may have worn the uniform with honor, but on this day, he betrayed everything it stands for." Marcus felt something break inside him, not from the words but from the exhaustion of fighting a system that had already decided his guilt. He'd saved 800 lives, and all they could see was his disobedience. In their world, being right didn't matter if you were right in the wrong way. That night, back in the temporary housing where he was confined during the trial, Marcus seriously considered giving up. He could accept the verdict, take his punishment, and disappear into whatever civilian life awaited him. At least it would be over. At least he could stop fighting. The knock on his door came at 2300 hours, well past the time when visitors were allowed. Marcus opened it to find Private First Class Amy Sullivan, a 22-year-old combat medic who'd been part of the convoy. He recognized her from the roster but had never spoken to her directly. She looked terrified and determined in equal measure. "Sir, I need to talk to you. Off the record." Marcus let her in, and she pulled out her phone with shaking hands. "I wasn't supposed to keep this. We were all ordered to delete any personal recordings from the convoy, but I made a backup. I don't know what I thought, that maybe someday someone would want to know what really happened." She showed him a video, taken from inside one of the convoy vehicles as they diverted to the northern route. The dawn light was gray and uncertain, and you could hear the nervous chatter of soldiers who'd been told there was a credible threat on their original path. The video panned across faces, young men and women processing the fact that someone had tried to kill them and failed. At one point, a grizzled sergeant looked directly at the camera and said, "That crazy contractor probably just saved all our asses. Somebody buy that Marine a beer when this is over." "There's more," Sullivan said, swiping to another file. "I recorded the command frequency during the diversion. I wasn't supposed to, but I did. You can hear Major Kowalski trying to get confirmation about the threat from Colonel Davidson. And you can hear him tell her to stand down, that they'd deal with you after the convoy completed its mission. He knew, sir. He knew there was evidence of the ambush even before the drone found it, and he was already planning to bury you." Marcus looked at the young medic, this kid who was risking her entire career to hand him leverage in a fight that wasn't hers. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I have a brother and a mom back in Michigan who still have me because you gave a damn about something other than your career. And because they taught me that silence in the face of injustice makes you part of it." She met his eyes with steel he'd only ever seen in combat veterans. "Use it, sir. Don't let them win." Captain Reeves nearly wept when Marcus showed her the recordings. "This is it. This is what we need. But you understand what happens if we use this? Sullivan's career is over. Mine probably is too, and they'll come after us with everything they have for violating security protocols and recording classified communications." "I know," Marcus said, "but I'm done being quiet. 800 families still have their sons and daughters, their mothers and fathers, because I refuse to let protocol matter more than lives. If the system can't handle that truth, then the system is broken." The final day of the trial was packed with more bodies than the courtroom was designed to hold. Word had leaked somehow, probably through the network of junior officers and NCOs who'd started calling themselves Chen's witnesses. They couldn't testify, couldn't speak publicly, but they could fill every available seat and let the panel see that this case was being watched. Captain Reeves called Private Sullivan to the stand as a surprise witness, and the prosecution objected immediately on grounds of relevancy and security. The judge, a colonel who'd been increasingly uncomfortable with the proceedings, allowed limited testimony about the convoy experience, but barred discussion of classified communications. Reeves nodded as if that was exactly what she'd expected, then played the video of the convoy soldiers, their relief and gratitude captured in a moment of genuine emotion. "Members of the panel, you've heard the prosecution describe Captain Chen as delusional, as a rogue actor who endangered lives. But these are the lives he supposedly endangered. These soldiers, who were told there was a credible threat and trusted that information, who completed their mission successfully and safely, who are alive today because one man chose conscience over convenience, Then Reeves pivoted, her voice hardening. But let's talk about what really happened here. Because this case isn't about military discipline. It's about covering up a conspiracy that nearly resulted in the greatest loss of American military life in Europe since World War II. Captain Chen's defense formally requests that this panel order a full investigation into the financial irregularities identified in his initial intelligence report, and into the classification decisions that buried evidence of a coordinated ambush. The prosecutor shot to his feet. Your Honor, this is completely outside the scope of... The scope of this trial is whether Captain Chen's actions were justified, Reeves interrupted, and that requires examining what he was trying to prevent. The defense has evidence that Colonel Davidson and other senior officers were aware of credible threats to the convoy and chose to ignore them for reasons that had nothing to do with military effectiveness. The courtroom erupted into chaos. The judge called for order, the prosecution demanded sanctions, and the panel members leaned forward with the sudden intensity of people realizing they might be part of something much bigger than a simple court-martial. Reeves couldn't play the full recordings, not without destroying Sullivan and herself. But she'd done something more important. She'd introduced reasonable doubt and pointed at the shadows where the real story lived. It took the panel 4 hours to reach a verdict. Marcus stood at attention while they filed back in, his heart hammering but his face calm. He'd done everything he could. If they found him guilty, at least he'd made them work for it. The senior panel member, a Marine colonel named Patterson who'd served in Fallujah, stood with the formal rigidity of a man delivering words that mattered. In the matter of United States versus Chen, on the charge of insubordination, we find the defendant not guilty. On the charge of unauthorized access to classified systems, we find the defendant not guilty. On the charge of reckless endangerment of military operations, we find the defendant not guilty. Patterson paused, and for just a moment his military bearing cracked enough to show something human underneath. Furthermore, this panel recommends immediate investigation into the intelligence failures and classification decisions surrounding Operation Iron Bridge. Captain Chen's actions, while unorthodox, were consistent with his duty to protect American lives. In a choice between procedure and preservation of life, this panel finds that he made the correct decision. Marcus felt his knees go weak with relief, but he stayed standing through the formal conclusion of proceedings. Captain Reeves gripped his shoulder hard enough to leave bruises, tears running down her face. Private Sullivan, watching from the gallery, gave him a small nod that carried more weight than any medal. And in the back of the courtroom, Major Kowalski allowed herself a brief smile before disappearing into the crowd. The aftermath was messy and political, and exactly what Marcus had expected. Colonel Davidson and 3 other officers faced their own court-martial proceedings, conducted behind closed doors with the kind of aggressive legal maneuvering that suggested someone very powerful wanted the story contained. Captain Brennan and his co-conspirators were quietly transferred to military prisons, while the full extent of their conspiracy remained classified. The official story became that Marcus had identified a security threat through diligent analysis and that his decisive action had saved lives. His violation of protocol was dismissed as an unfortunate but necessary choice in exigent circumstances. They offered him his job back, along with a formal commendation and a personal apology from a 2-star general who'd probably never read his case file. Marcus stood in the general's office, looking at the American flag in the corner and the photos of soldiers on the wall, and felt nothing but exhaustion. "Thank you, sir, but I'm declining. I think I'm done with military service." The general had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I understand this has been difficult, Captain, but men like you are exactly what we need. People who aren't afraid to make hard choices. With respect, sir, you don't want people like me. You want people who make hard choices and then keep quiet about them when the system gets embarrassed. I can't be that person anymore." Marcus signed out of the base on a cold April morning when the Polish countryside was finally shaking off winter. He'd sold most of his possessions, packed what remained into a duffel bag, and bought a one-way ticket to Krakow, because it seemed as good a place as any to figure out what came next. Private Sullivan had sent him a message saying she was leaving the military too, going back to school to study journalism because someone needed to tell the stories that official channels buried. Captain Reeves was facing an ethics investigation but seemed weirdly energized by it, like she'd finally found the fight worth having. Major Kowalski walked him to the gate, her hands shoved deep in her pockets against the morning chill. "You know they're already rewriting the story, right? In 6 months. This'll be a case study in military academies about proper channels and chain of command. You'll be a cautionary tale about cowboys who get lucky. I don't care, Marcus said, and realized it was true. 800 people went home to their families. That's all that matters. Is it? Kowalski studied him with those sharp eyes. Because you lost your career, your reputation, 3 months of your life to a kangaroo court, and you're walking away from the only world you've ever known. That has to matter too. Marcus thought about it, watching the sunrise turn the concrete bunkers golden. I thought being a Marine meant following orders and trusting the system. 4 deployments, 3 combat tours, more firefights than I can count. I did everything by the book because I believed the book was written by people who knew better than me. But standing in that courtroom, watching them twist the truth to protect themselves, I realized something. Honor isn't about following rules. It's about knowing when the rules are wrong and having the courage to break them. That's a lonely philosophy. Yeah, Marcus admitted. But I can live with lonely. I can't live with 800 families planning funerals because I was too scared to trust my gut. He walked through the gate into civilian life with his duffel bag and his court-martial records and a phone full of messages from soldiers thanking him for a debt they'd never be able to repay. The base shrank behind him, and Poland stretched ahead, beautiful and indifferent. He didn't know what came next. Maybe teaching, maybe consulting, maybe something completely different. But for the first time in years, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. Marcus Chen had learned that saving lives sometimes meant sacrificing everything else. That doing the right thing wasn't about glory or recognition, but about being able to look at yourself in the mirror. That the system was designed to protect itself first and the truth second, and that real courage meant fighting it anyway. He'd been court-martialed for preventing a massacre. They'd tried to destroy him for being right, and he'd walk away from it all knowing that somewhere in America, 800 families were sitting down to dinner together, completely unaware that their world had almost ended on a gray Polish morning. That was enough. It had to be enough. Because in the end, that's what honor actually cost. Not your life in a dramatic sacrifice, but your career in a quiet one. And Marcus had made his peace with that price. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the earth, and Marcus kept walking.